Hello, my name is Robbie. On here, I'm Templar Knight. Every person who believes in God but does not attend a church has a story why. But whenever two or more people gather in God's name, He is there. So this is church. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we are finally going to finish up the story of King David. King David the Great. This has been a longer path than I intended it to be, and I've been much more vested in this story than I thought I would be. I honestly came to this thinking, I don't know where to go next. Let's do this story. It's something that will buy me some time until I can figure out what my next lesson is going to be. And I've realized why God sent me to do this. Why He said, hey, you're doing the story of King David next. So I want to thank you guys for coming along on this journey with me. The storytelling was something new to me. The sounds and the videos and the pictures was different. The writing out all the lessons and sitting around typing was different. I've always been a free-form pastor. My notes normally consist of maybe 3 or 4 sentences. And now they consist of, well, tonight, 14 pages that I've gone through and typed out. Because when I'm telling someone's story, when I'm telling the story of King David the Great, I need to be precise. I need to be accurate. I need to be better prepared. So we will continue. Wars have been won. Again. Rebellions have been put down. Again. And David is growing old. But there are still some things he has to do before his time is done. And one of the main things that has always been stuck in David's heart was the one thing that he was told he could not do. And that was build a temple. When David brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem to make it his permanent home, he wanted to build it a permanent structure so that the presence of God would not just be in a tent, that it could have some place nice and fancy and solid. But David was told by God, through the prophet Nathan, that he was not allowed to build this temple, that the temple must be left for his son. Now, when we talked about that, I didn't explain why. And the reason why David couldn't build the temple was, even though he was a great man, David was a man of war. God used David to secure his nation, to expand its borders, and destroy Israel's enemies. But to be that man took many years of combat and violence. And it turned him into a warrior. It turned him into a leader that God needed him to be. Now, I know with all that we've talked about, I don't want you to think that David was just some mindless barbarian who was good at killing things, because that wasn't how David won these battles. It wasn't how David won the wars. He won because through all of the violence and fighting, David was faithful to his Lord, and he was always seeking God's guidance. It never said that David would go into a blind fury and rage and just mindlessly kill. He was a smart fighter, and that was how he always won. When the battle was over, he was a poet. He was a songwriter, a musical prodigy who praised and worshipped the Lord. So although it was clear that David was faithful, that he was a loyal servant of God, he was still a warrior with a lot of blood on his hands. God needed his temple to be built by a peaceful man, so that his temple could be a place for all nations to pray. How many Philistines do you think would have gone and worshipped at the temple of David? They might have some resentment against that man. But just because David cannot build it doesn't mean he can't help. So David starts off by purchasing the materials needed. He starts raising funds. He starts buying the things needed to build this structure worthy to house the Ark of the Covenant. Now, when I say David started to raise funds, I don't mean he raised the taxes from his people so that the nation could raise money. In fact, I'm going to tell you the process in which God had David gather this money. And a handful of you might notice something interesting about how God leads people to raise money for his purposes. See, the first thing that David does is David takes a large sum of his own personal money and he gives it to the building fund. See, he starts it. Secondly, David goes to his leaders, to his political allies and his advisors, the well-to-do that lead the nation, and he asks them to do the same. He asks them to give, to help build this temple. And when they see what David has given, they're inspired by their leader, and they too give. And then, once a large fund has already been established by the rich and the powerful, then David asks the people of Israel to help. He doesn't raise their taxes. He doesn't force them to give. He doesn't take from them. He gives them the opportunity so that they can give what they can to help with God's temple. And seeing what their leaders have already done, they too give. And far more money was raised than expected. For those of you who know why this sounds familiar in this group, you know. And for those of you who don't, feel free to ask after the lesson's over, and I will gladly tell you the story. But right now, we're going to continue talking about David. So with all this funding, these materials purchased, engineers, builders are hired, plans are made. And the whole time that things are being organized, David has his son Solomon there to learn from the builders and the designers, to understand what is being done and how and why. Solomon is taking part because Solomon, David's youngest son to his wife Bathsheba, he was loved by the Lord, and he was chosen to be next in line as king. Solomon would be the king God chose to have the temple built. Also, David is doing all he can to prepare his son. He's doing what he can to prepare him to build and to rule. And he gives his son words of encouragement. The aged king says, "My son, be strong, be brave. Do not be afraid or discouraged. Most importantly, know that the Lord God, my God, is with you, and he will not fail or forsake you until the temple is finished. The priests are ready. The builders are ready. Every skilled craftsman is ready to help you in all of your work, and they will obey you. So guide them, and allow the Lord to guide you." David's getting old. He's getting slow. He can no longer go for walks over the rooftops of his palaces like he once did. He finds himself in bed, resting. He still wants to write, but his hands are not as nimble as they once were. So he has scribes brought to him so that they can write down his words. See, David has an important book that he wishes to write. A book that will list all of the great people he knew, so that they also would be remembered. For David, his story wasn't only about him, but also about the people around him. So he would not have them forgotten over time. So he would lay in bed, and he would tell stories. He would recant memories of the feats of his mighty warriors. Now, I wanted to go and acknowledge these people and tell their stories, because David told their stories so that we could know. And if David thought this was so important that he would take the time to tell us of these people, then I want to take the time to tell of them. But this is week 10 of a 4-week series, and I'm supposed to be teaching about David. So we're going to skip these stories. But I want to give you some optional homework, if you want it. Go to 2 Samuel and read chapter 23. Because David wanted these names remembered. David wanted us to know this list of the 37 of his mightiest. There is one person I will point out, though, and that is the very last name on this list: Uriah the Hittite. A name sound familiar? Uriah? He was the first husband of Bathsheba, the man whose wife David had an affair with. Uriah was the man that David had killed in an attempt to cover up his sin. David chose, even in this, not to try and hide what he had done. Now I can just see the scribes and the priests gathering around the old king's bed as they write the stories, they write the lists. "My king, are you sure you want to add him to your list? If we put him in this book, it's only going to remind people of what happened between you and his wife and everything that followed. Perhaps in these final words we could just leave him out. and not remind the people of your transgression. The old king sits up in bed. No, no, no. Uriah was a great man, and he earned his place on this list. He did nothing wrong by me. It was I who did wrong by him, and I will not push his name aside and have him forgotten to cover up my sin and my transgressions. Uriah never failed me. I failed him. So I will not have him forgotten, for he too was a great man. And so in this book, there's a list of 37 of David's mightiest, not 36. There isn't much time left for David, and I wish that I could say that the transition of his rule to his son Solomon went without complication. But apparently there was one last rebellion to be put down. See, Solomon is David's youngest son. And although there is no set rule of succession in Israel, mainly because they're still pretty new at this, well, David's older son, Adonijah, has decided that this is his moment. With his father incapable of most anything, he's going to make a play to make himself king. And he gathers a handful of people whom he thinks will be loyal and understand that he would make a better king than his 20-year-old little brother. He gathers many of David's people to his cause, including Abiathar. You remember that name. He was the first priest to join David. Abiathar was the priest whose father gave David the bread and the sword of Goliath, and was later killed for it. Abiathar has been with David since the days of the Gibberim. Another key player that Adonijah convinced was Joab, the leader of David's army. He convinced him that he would make a better military leader than his young thinker of a brother who only seems to be focused on building this temple. So the militant Joab goes over and sides with Adonijah, and not David's chosen. So this alliance of, well, traitors, they gather one night to come up with a plan to make Adonijah the successor to the throne. I mean, clearly they had gathered enough of David's key people that this coup would go off. It would work perfectly, and the people's eyes would see it as the rightful king. Well, they forgot one key person. See, they forgot to involve David's best ally. They never invited God to this. Probably because they knew that God had already chosen Solomon. So here's the problem when you go against God. God cheats. He does not play by your rules. So even though they thought they had this super secret meeting that nobody could possibly know about, God knew. And what was God's play? He tells the prophet Nathan of what's going on. And Nathan, he is quick to respond when hearing the word of God. So he goes to a rather unlikely ally. He goes to Solomon's mother, Bathsheba. Now, Nathan and Bathsheba, they might not be the best of friends. I mean, he did kind of expose her sin in front of the entire nation, which I'm sure didn't help her image at all. I mean, to be fair, before I started this series, I personally already had an unfair opinion and image in my mind of this woman, Bathsheba. Whenever I heard her name, I already knew what I thought of her. Not fair. So although they may not have been super close, they did have one thing in common. And they could set aside their differences because they both knew that Solomon was to be the next king. So Bathsheba goes to David's side as a loving wife and a caring mother. She takes her husband's hand and she reminds him of his words, how he said that her son Solomon would be king after him, that God had chosen Solomon to rule and to build the temple. Yes, Solomon must be king when I am gone. Solomon. Yes, God wishes for Solomon to rule. Such a good man. He will do well, my Solomon. And once Bathsheba has reminded him, the prophet Nathan enters. My king, I am confused. Have you declared that Adonijah shall be king? For he's gathered priests and men to him, and they are saying, Long live King Adonijah. But I thought that you and the Lord had chosen your son Solomon to be king. I thought you and the Lord had chosen Solomon to build the temple, not Adonijah. And at this news, the old man stirs. He understands what is happening. He sits up in his bed and he looks to his wife. And the memories of a younger David can be seen in his eyes. And he looks to her. As surely as the Lord lives, the Lord who has delivered me from every trouble, I swear to you on this day, by the God of Israel, that Solomon, your son, shall be king after me, and he will sit the throne in my place. Nathan, bring the priests and the holy oils. Bring my son Solomon to me. It is time that he is anointed the next king. And when it is done, have him seated on my throne and sound the horns. Send forth messengers and musicians into the streets to sing and cheer and shout, Long live King Solomon. And from this night forth, Solomon shall reign. He shall rule over all of Israel. So on the other side of the city, in a dark, quiet home, Adonijah plots with his people, making their plans on how they plan to take the throne. They sit and they feast on a great meal, talking, laughing, and dreaming of all of the great things they will do once they have control of Israel. What? What is this? Why have they sounded the horns so late? Are we under attack? And they take to the roof to see why the horn was blown, to summon the city of Jerusalem. And in the distance, torches are being lit and spreading from the palace. And they hear musicians and the trumpets sounding. Jerusalem is waking up, gathering in the streets to see what all the commotion is about, for something important must have happened. Adonijah and his conspirators watch as this wave of light comes closer, and the sounds of celebration spread throughout all of Jerusalem. Finally, it reaches them, and they can hear the shouts. David has declared Solomon king! Long live King Solomon! And everyone is celebrating, as only the city of Jerusalem can. Well, almost everyone. Adonijah sees his plan crushed before he could even take action. He sulks back inside as his conspirators quietly disperse into the crowds. They realize their plans, their dreams are lost. They are broken. They're not even sure how they failed and where they went wrong. But clearly, they do not understand the power of God. And so long into the night, or at least what is left of it, Jerusalem celebrates to the new King of Israel. Long live King Solomon. How do I end this? How do I finish the story of King David? I will end this reading from God's Word. Reading the words King David had for his son Solomon when they knew his time was near. Or at least I was going to read this. But I can't get through it. There is a phrase in this passage that hits too close to home for me. And every time I read it, I break. So I asked my friend Jake if he would read it for me. So this is what David had to say to his son in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 1 through 4.
When David's time to die approached, he charged his son Solomon, saying, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. But you, be strong. Show what you're made of. Do what God tells you. Walk in the paths he shows you. Follow his plans absolutely. Keep an eye out for the signposts. His course for life set out in the revelation to Moses. Then you'll get on well in whatever you do and wherever you go. Then God will confirm what he promised me when he said, if your sons watch their step, staying true to me heart and soul, you'll always have a successor on Israel's throne.
Thank you, Jake. David spends his last days instructing his son, the new king, giving him advice on how to be a good ruler. And with Solomon securely seated upon his throne, ready to rule, ready to build God's temple for the Ark of the Covenant, at the age of 70, after ruling Israel for 40 years, David went to rest with his ancestors. And he was buried in Jerusalem, also known as the City of David. So ends the story of David the Great, the prodigal musician, poet, and songwriter, the giant slayer, the warrior, the rebel, the outlaw mercenary, the brilliant politician, the military leader, the king, the sinner. But most importantly, the faithful servant who spent his time worshiping his God. When life was hard, he worshiped. When life was great, he praised. David was a man constantly seeking God's presence. And it was that undying faith in the Lord that made him David the Great. But it was his unbreakable trust and knowledge that God would always be there for him that allowed David to live his life fearless.
You can call yourself a